The year was 1850. The air, a thick, suffocating blanket, hung heavy over the Louisiana bayou, smelling perpetually of cypress, stagnant water, and the slow, inevitable creep of decay. Far from civilization, nestled deep within this humid embrace, stood Belle Reve, a plantation whose very name, meaning beautiful dream, was a cruel mockery of its grim reality. It was a place where whispers traveled like disease, carried on the humid breeze, tales of its owner, Mr. Silas Blackwood, and his increasingly strange, desperate ways. Silas Blackwood was a man carved from the rough, unforgiving timber of the Old South. His face, etched with lines of worry and a fading grandeur, spoke of a fortune that was steadily eroding, much like the bayou itself nibbled at the edges of his land. He had inherited Belle Reve, a legacy of vast fields and even vaster debts, and with it, the unspoken burden of maintaining an image that was rapidly crumbling. His pride, however, remained as unyielding as the ancient oaks that dotted his property, even as his coffers emptied and his crops withered. His only daughter, Sarah, was a figure of quiet tragedy, a secret kept largely hidden from the world. Sarah was large, exceptionally so, a fact that her father found both mortifying and endlessly inconvenient. She rarely ventured beyond the confines of the main house, a pale, almost spectral presence whose movements were slow and deliberate. The few outsiders who caught a glimpse of her would exchange hushed glances, their whispers painting her as a recluse, a burden, a living testament to Blackwood's peculiar obsession with keeping her out of sight. Her size was a constant, gnawing shame for Silas, a blemish on the otherwise carefully constructed facade of his aristocratic life. He saw it not as a part of her, but as a flaw, a grotesque imperfection that diminished his standing in a society obsessed with appearances. But now appearances were the least of Silas Blackwood's worries. Belle Reve was bleeding money. The cotton fields, once the lifeblood of his prosperity, yielded meager harvests. The banks were growing impatient, their letters becoming increasingly stern, their threats more explicit. Financial ruin, a spectre he had long tried to ignore, was no longer merely lurking in the shadows. It stood squarely in his drawing room, demanding an answer. Blackwood was cornered, desperate, his mind racing through increasingly unthinkable solutions. He paced his study in the dead of night, the silence of the old house amplifying the frantic beat of his own heart, his desperation pushing him towards a precipice he never imagined he would approach. It was in this state of utter despair that he summoned his head foreman, Thomas. Thomas, a man whose loyalty was matched only by his quiet apprehension, stood before Blackwood, his eyes fixed respectfully on the floor. Blackwood, without preamble, delivered a pronouncement that sent a chill down Thomas's spine, a decision so shocking, so utterly depraved, that it seemed to hang in the air thick and suffocating like the bayou mist. He declared, his voice low and strained, that he would give Sarah to one of the slaves, not for marriage, not for companionship, but for a horrifying, unspoken purpose that Blackwood himself dared not articulate. The words hung heavy, unspoken between them, a dark understanding passing from master to servant. Thomas, a man who had seen much cruelty in his life, felt a cold dread grip him, but he knew better than to speak, better than to question his master's madness. He simply nodded, his face impassive, his heart heavy with a terrible premonition. The chosen one, Blackwood announced, would be Ezekiel. Ezekiel was a figure of quiet enigma on the plantation. He was powerfully built, his muscles corded from years of arduous labor, yet he moved with an almost ethereal grace. He rarely spoke, his eyes often distant, as if gazing upon a world unseen by others. His gaze, when it did settle upon someone, was intense, unsettling, a silent challenge that made people instinctively uncomfortable. He possessed a strange solitude, an aura of otherness that set him apart from the other enslaved people. He was known for his strength, but also for a certain aloofness, an impenetrable quality that made him both respected and feared. It was rumored he understood the ancient ways, the secrets of the earth and the spirits that dwelled within the bayou, though no one dared to speak of such things openly. The news, once it inevitably filtered through the slave quarters, was met with a stunned silence, then a wave of horrified understanding. The other slaves, their faces etched with fear and resignation, kept their thoughts to themselves. They understood Blackwood's cruelty, his capacity for the unthinkable. They knew that to question him was to invite a swift and brutal retribution. Their eyes, however, spoke volumes, reflecting a shared dread. They wondered what unspeakable fate awaited Sarah, the master's daughter, now reduced to a chattel, a pawn in her father's desperate game. But more chillingly, they wondered what fate awaited Ezekiel, the quiet man with the intense gaze, chosen for a task whose true nature remained shrouded in a terrifying ambiguity. The air around Belle Reve, already heavy with the scent of decay, grew thick with a new, suffocating dread, a sense of impending doom that settled over the plantation like a shroud. The beautiful dream had become a waking nightmare. Blackwood's lineage, though steeped in the perceived glory of the southern aristocracy, carried a darker, more insidious thread beneath its gilded surface. He hadn't always been the cruel, calculating man he was now, but the seeds of his desperation were sown generations ago. His father, a man of chilling intellect and even colder ambition, was known not just for his extensive landholdings, but for strange, whispered experiments conducted in the deepest, most secluded parts of the plantation. These were not agricultural experiments, but something far more esoteric, a fascination with the land's raw power, its hidden energies, and the peculiar properties of its flora and fauna. Blackwood had inherited Belle Reve not merely as property, but as a legacy burdened by an unspoken, unsettling history, a silent pressure to maintain a certain order, a certain control, even if it meant dabbling in the fringes of the unknown. His inheritance was less a gift and more a heavy ancestral chain, binding him to the land and its secrets, compelling him to keep it afloat no matter the cost. Sarah's childhood began innocently enough. She was born a healthy, rosy-cheeked infant, a beacon of hope in a household often shadowed by her father's brooding temperament. But as she grew, a peculiar change began to manifest. Her appetite, initially robust, became insatiable, a hunger that seemed to defy all reason and proportion. She consumed vast quantities of food, her body expanding at an alarming rate far beyond what was considered normal. Her father, a man obsessed with appearances and control, quickly grew ashamed. He saw her burgeoning size not as a medical anomaly, but as a personal failing, a grotesque reflection of his inability to control even his own daughter. The shame festered, transforming into a fierce desire to hide her, to erase the visual evidence of his perceived imperfection. He began to isolate her, first subtly, then overtly, restricting her interaction with the outside world, creating a gilded cage within the grand house. Paradoxically, while he sought to hide her, he continued to feed her, excessively, almost compulsively, as if trying to satiate an emptiness within himself by filling her. This created a strange, unhealthy dynamic, a twisted bond forged in shame and overindulgence, fostering within Sarah a deep-seated resentment, a simmering anger at her father's suffocating control, and his thinly veiled disgust. She became a prisoner of her own body and her father's rigid expectations, her spirit slowly suffocating under the weight of both. Ezekiel, the man chosen for Blackwood's unthinkable task, was an enigma. Brought to Belle Reve as a young man, he was markedly different from the other enslaved people. He moved with a quiet intensity, his presence felt more than heard. Words were a scarce commodity for him, used only when absolutely necessary, but his eyes, dark and ancient, seemed to absorb everything, missing no detail of the world around him. He possessed an uncanny, almost primordial understanding of the bayou, its dense, tangled ecosystems, its hidden paths, the potent properties of its plants and the habits of its elusive creatures. He could identify herbs by scent alone, track game through the thickest undergrowth, and predict changes in the weather with an accuracy that bordered on prescience. These abilities, coupled with his profound silence and unsettling gaze, fueled hushed whispers among the other slaves. They spoke of old ways, of forbidden magic, of spirits and ancestors. Some believed he communed with the spirits of the swamp, that he held knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge both powerful and dangerous. He carried himself with a quiet intensity, an unsettling self-possession that made even the most hardened men wary. Blackwood, in his desperate hour, approached Ezekiel privately, away from prying ears. The master's voice, usually booming, was low, almost conspiratorial. He did not explicitly detail the horrifying purpose he had in mind, but his words, carefully chosen, painted a chilling picture. He spoke of Sarah, of her condition, and of the need for a solution. He made it clear that if Ezekiel took care of Sarah, if he managed to resolve her situation, his own life would be spared from the grueling, back-breaking labor of the fields. There was an unspoken understanding, a dark current flowing beneath Blackwood's carefully veiled words, that this task involved far more than mere companionship or care. It implied a transformation, an alteration, something beyond the natural order. Ezekiel listened, his face an unreadable mask. His eyes, usually distant and unfathomable, flickered with something that Blackwood could not decipher, perhaps understanding, perhaps a deep, unsettling comprehension of the dark arts his master was unknowingly invoking, or perhaps something far more sinister, an ancient malevolence stirring within him. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the terrible pact. When Sarah was finally told of her father's arrangement, the news struck her with a cold, brutal clarity. Initially, she was confused, her mind struggling to grasp the implications of being given to a slave. But confusion quickly gave way to a silent, simmering rage, a fury that burned deep within her. She understood with a painful, visceral certainty that her father viewed her not as a daughter, but as a burden, a problem to be solved, a thing to be disposed of. She was a piece of property, to be bartered and traded for his convenience. She saw Ezekiel not as a man, but as another instrument in her father's cruel hands, a tool to enact whatever twisted solution he had devised for her. The resentment, already a heavy cloak, intensified, wrapping around her heart, hardening her resolve. Though for what, she did not yet know. Her isolation had bred a profound bitterness, and now this final indignity cemented her belief that she was utterly alone, a pawn in a game she had no say in, destined for a fate orchestrated by her father's shame and desperation. The dark current that ran through Belle Reve had now ensnared her completely. Ezekiel was given a small, isolated shack, almost swallowed by the encroaching swamp, far from the main slave quarters, a place where the pervasive humidity clung to everything, and the air was thick with the scent of decaying vegetation and the unseen life of the bayou. This desolate dwelling, perpetually shrouded in a thin, ethereal mist that rose from the murky waters, was to be Sarah's new home, her new prison. It was a place of shadows and dampness, where the sounds of the outside world were muffled, replaced by the incessant chirping of unseen insects and the guttural croaking of frogs. The shack itself was rudimentary, constructed from rough-hewn timber and patched with whatever materials could be scavenged, its single window perpetually fogged, offering only an obscured view of the dense, claustrophobic foliage that pressed in from all sides. It was a place chosen for its remoteness, its inherent ability to conceal, to isolate, to swallow secrets. Sarah was moved to the shack with a quiet, unsettling efficiency. She offered no resistance, her spirit seemingly broken, her initial rage having settled into a deep, pervasive sullenness. Her eyes, once capable of flashes of defiance, now held a vacant, resentful stare. She moved like a somnambulist, a heavy, unwilling figure resigned to her fate. Ezekiel, ever silent, watched her with an inscrutable gaze. He didn't offer comfort, didn't speak words of reassurance or even acknowledgement. He simply watched, his dark eyes absorbing every nuance of her despair, every tremor of her suppressed anger. He didn't touch her, didn't make any overt move that might suggest a more conventional form of companionship. His interactions were purely functional, almost ritualistic. He brought her food, not the rich, heavy meals she was accustomed to from the main house, but simple earthy things, wild-caught fish from the bayou, dark, root vegetables dug from the swampy soil, and dense, unleavened bread. The sustenance was coarse, unappetizing, a stark contrast to the luxurious excess that had defined her previous existence. Then Ezekiel's work began, a process that defied any conventional understanding of care. He did not attempt to reduce her size, as Blackwood might have secretly hoped. There were no exercises, no restrictive diets. Instead, he started to feed her peculiar concoctions, These were not meals in the traditional sense, but strange, viscous liquids and pulpy mixtures. He brewed teas from unknown plants, their leaves and stems gathered from the deepest, most inaccessible parts of the swamp. He presented her with strange gnarled roots, ground into a fine powder and mixed with water, forming a thick, dark broth that tasted of earth and something indefinable, something ancient. He insisted she consume them, his silent presence a powerful, unyielding demand. There was no room for refusal, no opportunity for negotiation. He would simply hold the cup or the bowl, his gaze unwavering until she complied. At first, Sarah's body reacted with a profound sense of discomfort. She felt bloated, unwell, her stomach churning with the unfamiliar, potent ingredients. Her body didn't seem to change in the way one might expect from any sort of treatment. There was no immediate weight loss, no sudden burst of energy. Instead, she felt a strange dullness begin to creep over her, a growing lethargy that permeated her limbs and clouded her mind. Her thoughts became sluggish, her once fiery resentment now a distant, muffled echo. She started to feel detached from her own body, as if her limbs were no longer entirely her own, her senses muted, her connection to the physical world slowly fraying. It was a subtle, insidious transformation, beginning not with outward signs but with an internal shift, a creeping numbness that dulled her very essence. The other slaves, despite the isolation of the shack, began to notice. Sarah's complete absence from the main house, her sudden disappearance, fueled their fears. A new, unsettling detail emerged, a strange, sickly sweet smell that occasionally drifted from Ezekiel's shack, carried on the damp air, especially after dusk. It wasn't the smell of decay nor of cooking, but something else entirely, something cloying and unnatural, like overripe fruit mixed with damp earth and something metallic. Whispers grew louder, more frantic, circulating through the slave quarters like a fever. They spoke of Ezekiel's magic, of the dark arts he was rumored to practice. Their fears, already heightened by Blackwood's cruelty, now focused on what he might be doing to the master's daughter in that isolated shack, what dark transformation he might be enacting. The fear was palpable, a cold, creeping dread that settled deep in their bones, a warning to stay far away from that place where the mist always lingered, and the strange smells emanated. Blackwood, driven by a mixture of impatience and a morbid curiosity, occasionally rode out to the shack. He would approach cautiously, observing from a distance, his eyes scanning for any sign of change, any indication that Ezekiel's strange methods were producing the outcome he envisioned, whatever that outcome truly was. He looked for a transformation, a solution to his problem. But what he saw only deepened his unease. He saw Sarah, still isolated, still a large, silent figure within the dim confines of the shack, her movements increasingly slow and deliberate. He saw Ezekiel, impassive and dedicated, tending to her with an unwavering focus that was both unsettling and unnerving. There were no dramatic improvements, no sudden shifts. Blackwood, accustomed to immediate results, grew increasingly impatient. He would demand answers, his voice laced with frustration. Ezekiel, however, remained steadfast, his response always the same, delivered in a low, guttural murmur that seemed to carry the weight of ancient knowledge. "It takes time, Master. Great changes, they always take time." His words were a promise and a threat, a chilling assurance that something was indeed happening, even if Blackwood couldn't yet comprehend its true nature. The Master was playing a dangerous game, and Ezekiel was holding all the cards. Sarah's physical appearance, though not drastically altered in terms of weight reduction, began to undergo a series of subtle, unsettling shifts. Her skin, once flushed with a certain unhealthy pallor, now took on an almost translucent quality, as if the very blood beneath it was thinning, receding. It was a ghostly hue stark against the dark, damp interior of the shack. Her eyes, once merely sullen, became sunken, receding deeper into their sockets, yet they held an unsettling gleam, a faint, almost phosphorescent light that seemed to emanate from within, giving them an unnatural intensity that was both captivating and horrifying. This wasn't the look of a person wasting away, but of something else entirely, something being refined, distilled. A new, unnatural hunger began to stir within Sarah, a craving unlike any she had known before. It wasn't the familiar, insatiable appetite for food that had plagued her entire life. This was a hunger for something else entirely, an undefined, insistent gnawing deep within her very being. She would become agitated, restless, her body trembling with a strange internal tremor if Ezekiel didn't bring her his special concoctions at precisely the appointed times. The thick, dark broths, the bitter teas, the pulverized roots, these had become not merely sustenance but an absolute necessity. She found herself craving them with an intensity that bordered on addiction, her mind and body now utterly dependent on the strange alchemy Ezekiel was performing upon her. The taste, once repulsive, now held a strange, earthy comfort, a promise of satiation for this new, unsettling void within her. Ezekiel, in his quiet, methodical way, began to perform strange, almost ritualistic acts within the confines of the shack. The air, already heavy with the scent of damp earth and unknown herbs, would thicken further with the acrid smoke of burning plants, their leaves and resins smouldering in a small clay pot. He would chant softly, his voice a low guttural murmur in a language none of the other slaves understood, a cadence that seemed to resonate with the very pulse of the bayou itself. He drew symbols on the packed earth floor with crushed charcoal and dried blood, intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light filtering through the single grimy window. Sarah would watch him, half terrified by his unwavering focus and the eerie atmosphere he created, yet half mesmerized by the sheer intensity of his devotion to this strange process. A part of her, the last vestiges of her conscious will, wanted to resist, to scream, but the other, larger part, the part that craved his concoctions, felt an undeniable pull, a strange sense of surrender to his will. Her body, though increasingly docile to the internal changes, began to react in unpredictable, often violent ways. She experienced intense, searing aches that racked her bones, making her muscles seize and cramp. Strange fevers would grip her, causing her skin to burn with an internal heat, only to be followed by bone-chilling cold. Her sleep was no longer restful. Instead, she was plagued by vivid, disturbing dreams, nightmares that blurred the lines between reality and hallucination. She saw herself as a creature of the swamp, her flesh becoming one with the mud and the roots, her consciousness dissolving into the collective memory of the ancient bayou. She would try, in moments of lucidity, to resist Ezekiel, to refuse the next dose of his potent brew, her hand pushing away the cup. But a strange, overpowering compulsion would always overcome her. It was as if her own will had been eroded, replaced by an instinctual drive to consume whatever he offered, a silent, internal command that brooked no disobedience. One night, a young slave, sent to retrieve a runaway pig that had wandered too close to the shack, heard a sound that froze him in his tracks. It was a low, guttural moan, a sound unlike anything he had ever heard from a human throat. It was deep, resonant and filled with an ancient sorrow, yet also a chilling, predatory hunger. It seemed to emanate from the very walls of Ezekiel's shack, echoing through the thick, humid air of the swamp. The sound raised the hairs on his neck, sending a primal terror coursing through his veins. He didn't wait to investigate, didn't dare to glance back. He fled in blind panic, stumbling through the undergrowth, spreading tales of demons and unholy rites performed in the shack, tales that only deepened the pervasive fear surrounding Ezekiel and the master's daughter. Blackwood, increasingly agitated and impatient, began to visit the shack more frequently. His initial curiosity had morphed into a growing unease, a gnawing sense of dread. He would stand at the entrance, peering into the dim interior, trying to discern what exactly was happening. He saw Sarah, but she no longer looked quite human. Her eyes, those unsettlingly luminous points, held a vacant, distant stare, as if her consciousness resided somewhere far beyond the present moment. Her movements, when she did stir, were stiff, almost mechanical, lacking the fluidity of living flesh. Her skin, with its translucent quality, seemed stretched taut over unseen changes beneath. Ezekiel, ever the silent sentinel, remained impassive, his gaze unwavering, never offering explanation, only an unnerving certainty in his actions. Blackwood, for the first time, began to truly comprehend the gravity of his bargain, the monstrous path he had set in motion. He realized, with a chilling clarity, that he had unleashed something far more profound, far more terrifying than he had ever intended. He had sought a solution to a problem, but he had instead conjured a deepening mystery, an unholy transformation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his control, beyond his understanding. The bayou, in its silent, ancient wisdom, was reclaiming its own, and Sarah was merely the conduit. Weeks turned into months, the passage of time marked not by seasons, but by the deepening strangeness that permeated Belle Reve. Then, one day, Ezekiel emerged from the ever-present mist surrounding the shack, his gait as measured and deliberate as ever, and sought out Blackwood. His eyes, usually distant, held a new, unsettling intensity. He spoke in his low, guttural voice, the words carrying the weight of finality. "Master, my task is complete. You may see Sarah now." The declaration hung heavy in the humid air, a promise and a veiled threat. Blackwood felt a tremor of apprehension, a cold dread seeping into his bones, even as a morbid curiosity compelled him forward. He had yearned for an end to this unsettling process, yet now that it was here, a profound fear gripped him. Blackwood, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, made his way to the isolated shack. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with the cloying, sickly sweet scent that now permanently clung to the structure, a scent that hinted at decay and something profoundly unnatural. He pushed open the creaking door, the hinges groaning in protest, revealing the dim interior. He braced himself, expecting to see Sarah, perhaps thinner, perhaps changed in some discernible, albeit unusual, way. But what he beheld made the blood run cold in his veins, stealing the very breath from his lungs. Sarah was still large, her form filling the small space, but it was no longer the soft, yielding flesh he remembered. Her body, once a testament to overindulgence, had undergone a grotesque, horrifying metamorphosis. It was hardened, almost petrified in places, with strange, calcified growths and textures that resembled ancient weathered stone or twisted bark. Her skin, once translucent, was now a uniform, ghastly pale, almost grey, merging seamlessly with the unnatural growths. Her eyes, once merely sunken, were now completely black, devoid of pupils, reflecting no light, no discernible spark of humanity. They were like twin abysses, drawing in all light and hope. She stood, or rather existed, in a slow, unnatural posture, her limbs stiff, her movements a laborious, creaking affair, like an ancient mechanism grinding into motion. She was a living sculpture of horror, a monument to a twisted, dark art. Ezekiel, standing silently beside this monstrous creation, finally offered an explanation, his voice devoid of emotion, a chilling detachment in his tone. He hadn't made Sarah thin, nor had he restored her to any semblance of her former self. He had transformed her. He had used ancient dark practices, whispered down through generations of bayou mystics, combined with the potent, often poisonous ingredients found deep within the swamp. He had essentially mummified her alive, preserving her in a state of living decay. He had stripped her of her humanity, of her will, of her very essence, while keeping her alive in the most horrifying sense of the word. She was a living statue of horror, a grotesque parody of life, forever bound to her current state. "You wanted her body changed, Master," Ezekiel stated, his gaze meeting Blackwood's terrified eyes. "You wanted her to be unburdened. Now she is. She will never trouble you again. She will never leave." His words were a cold, brutal articulation of his twisted purpose. He had created a living monument to Blackwood's cruelty, a permanent, inescapable embodiment of Sarah's suffering, and in doing so, had bound them both to a fate far worse than death. She was a perpetual reminder, a silent, unmoving testament to the depths of human depravity and the terrifying power of the bayou's dark magic. Blackwood was consumed by a primal, all-encompassing fear. This was not the solution he had envisioned. He had wanted a problem removed, a burden lifted, not a monstrosity brought into being. He had sought control, and instead he had unleashed an unimaginable horror. He tried to articulate a command, to order Ezekiel to reverse it, to undo this abomination, but the words caught in his throat, choked by terror. Ezekiel merely smiled, a slow, cold, knowing smile that spread across his lips, a smile that held no warmth, only a profound, ancient satisfaction. It was the smile of a man who had fulfilled a sacred if terrifying pact. In her new, horrifying state, Sarah's hunger was different, more profound, more insidious than anything Blackwood could have imagined. As he stood frozen in terror, mesmerized by the grotesque spectacle, Sarah's stiff, calcified fingers slowly, deliberately reached out. They brushed against Blackwood's arm, a touch that was cold and hard like stone. A wave of profound dread washed over him, followed by a chilling, draining sensation, as if his very vitality was being siphoned away. He felt a sudden, inexplicable weakness in his limbs, a coldness spreading through his veins. He recoiled violently, stumbling backward, his mind screaming in silent horror. He had not merely created a monster, he had become its first unwitting victim. The monster his own daughter was now feeding, and the feast had only just begun. The terrible truth about Sarah began to leak out from the confines of the isolated shack, seeping into the very soil of Belle Reve. It started as whispers, carried on the humid breeze from the swamp, gaining substance and chilling detail with each retelling. Slaves who, out of necessity or sheer morbid curiosity, ventured too close to the shack reported strange occurrences. The persistent, sickly sweet aroma of decay mixed with unknown herbs, a scent that clung to their clothes and hair for days. Unexplained illnesses that left them weak and listless, their energy slowly draining away. And, most terrifying of all, a pervasive, chilling presence that seemed to emanate from the very structure, a cold dread that settled deep in their bones and refused to leave. The once bustling plantation, already a place of hardship and veiled fear, transformed into a landscape of pervasive supernatural dread. Every creak of the old house, every rustle in the cypress trees, seemed to hold a sinister meaning. The air itself felt heavy, charged with an unseen menace, and the slaves moved about their duties with downcast eyes, their movements subdued, their voices hushed, as if afraid to disturb the silent horror that now presided over their lives. Blackwood, the architect of this nightmare, began to waste away with alarming speed, haunted by the grotesque image of his transformed daughter, and the subtle, insidious effect her touch had on him. His once imposing figure started to diminish. He grew pale, his skin taking on an ashen hue that mirrored Sarah's own. His once thick, dark hair thinned rapidly, falling out in clumps, leaving his scalp exposed and vulnerable. The weight, which he had once carried with such arrogant disdain, seemed to melt from his frame, leaving him gaunt and skeletal. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, now held a haunted, desperate look, darting nervously, as if constantly searching for an escape from an invisible tormentor. He looked like a ghost, a living corpse consumed by the very horror he had wrought. He tried, in vain, to deny what was happening, to rationalize the creeping weakness, the pervasive lethargy, but the dread was a living thing inside him, consuming him from the inside out. A constant, gnawing presence that allowed him no peace. Sleep offered no respite, only vivid nightmares of Sarah's black eyes and the chilling touch that still lingered on his arm. As Blackwood weakened, both physically and mentally, Ezekiel's control over the plantation subtly, almost imperceptibly, increased. He moved with an air of quiet authority, a chilling sense of purpose that had been absent before. He didn't need to bark orders or wield a whip. His presence alone was enough. The other slaves, terrified of him and more profoundly of the monstrous being he had created, obeyed his unspoken commands with a newfound alacrity. They feared Sarah, the living statue, more than any human master, and Ezekiel was her keeper, her silent, watchful guardian. They saw the transformation in Blackwood, the visible evidence of Sarah's insidious power, and understood that defying Ezekiel meant risking a fate far worse than the lash. The power dynamic shifted completely. The master was now a victim, and the slave a silent, terrifying arbiter of their shared doom. Ezekiel had become the true, undisputed master of Belle Reve, not through force but through fear, through the sheer, unadulterated horror of his creation. Sarah, the living statue, became the embodiment of the plantation's decay, its dark, beating heart. Her presence in the shack, silent and motionless, was a constant draining force. Anyone who entered her shack, even for a moment, or simply got too close to its perimeter, felt it. A draining sensation, a cold emptiness spreading through their core. Their vitality, their very life force, seemed to slowly, imperceptibly leave them. It wasn't a violent act, no sudden attack or struggle. It was a slow, horrifying absorption, a gradual siphoning of energy, leaving its victims feeling hollowed out, exhausted and strangely cold. The plants around the shack withered and died. The very air seemed to grow thin and lifeless. Sarah was not merely existing, she was feeding, a silent, insatiable parasite, drawing sustenance from the living essence of Belle Reve and all who inhabited it. She was the anchor of their shared damnation, a constant, pervasive threat that needed no movement or sound to exert its terrifying power. Blackwood, now a mere shadow of his former self, frail and desperate, finally confronted Ezekiel. His voice, once booming and authoritative, was now a reedy whisper filled with a desperate plea. He found Ezekiel tending to some strange, glowing fungi near the shack, his back to the master. "Ezekiel," Blackwood rasped, his breath catching in his throat. "Please, undo this. Release me. Release her." He gestured feebly towards the shack, his hand trembling uncontrollably. "I beg you. I cannot bear this any longer." Ezekiel slowly turned, his eyes, dark and fathomless, fixing on Blackwood. A faint, almost imperceptible smile played on his lips, a cruel twist of satisfaction. He didn't speak, didn't offer comfort or explanation. Instead, he simply pointed a long, bony finger towards Sarah, who stood motionless in the dim interior of the shack, her black, empty eyes fixed on Blackwood, an eternal, silent accusation. "You made her this way, Master," Ezekiel said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate with ancient power. "Now she feeds." The words were a death knell, a chilling confirmation of Blackwood's irreversible fate. In a final, desperate act born of terror and utter despair, Blackwood decided he had to escape Belle Reve. He could no longer endure the suffocating dread, the insidious draining of his life force, the constant, silent judgment from his monstrous daughter. He stumbled towards the stables, his legs weak, his vision blurring. He managed to saddle his horse, his hands fumbling with the buckles, and with a surge of adrenaline, he mounted and spurred the animal into a frantic gallop down the long, winding path that led away from the plantation. The night air whipped past his face, momentarily clearing his head, filling him with a desperate, fleeting hope. But as he rode, he felt an overwhelming, invisible pull, a powerful, magnetic force drawing him back towards the looming silhouette of Belle Reve. It was as if the very land itself, intertwined with Sarah's monstrous existence, would not release its hold. The draining sensation intensified, his strength rapidly failing. His vision blurred completely, and a cold numbness spread through his limbs. He collapsed on the path, his body finally giving out, consumed by the lingering horror of his own creation. His horse whinnied, startled, and bolted into the darkness. Blackwood lay there, his last sight the distant, dark, and utterly inescapable silhouette of Belle Reve, still shrouded in the sickly sweet scent of decay, a final horrifying monument to his undoing. His breath hitched, a faint gasp, and then silence. Blackwood's body was discovered the following morning, slumped ignominiously by the main road, a few miles from the plantation gates. His once formidable frame was now shriveled and lifeless, his skin stretched taut over sharp bones, his eyes staring blankly at the indifferent sky. The local coroner, a man who had seen his share of bayou ailments, attributed the death to swamp fever, a convenient and unchallengeable diagnosis for any unexplained demise in that desolate region. Yet, among the few who dared to approach the scene, a grim, unspoken understanding passed between them. Everyone knew that something far more sinister had transpired at Belle Reve, something that defied medical explanation and whispered of ancient, malevolent forces. The official cause of death was a polite fiction. The true cause was a horror too profound to utter aloud. With Blackwood gone, a profound and terrifying shift occurred at Belle Reve. Ezekiel, the quiet, enigmatic slave, became the undisputed, terrifying master of the plantation. He didn't seize power through overt displays of force, nor did he rule with the whips and chains that had been the hallmark of Blackwood's dominion. Instead, his authority was chillingly subtle, emanating from a supernatural power that the remaining slaves instinctively understood. His gaze, once merely unsettling, now held an ancient, unyielding command. The fear he inspired was not the fear of physical punishment, but a deeper, more primal dread of the unknown, of the dark magic he wielded, and of the grotesque being he had so chillingly forged. His presence alone was enough to enforce absolute obedience, his every silent movement imbued with an eerie, almost sacred significance. Sarah, the grotesque living statue, remained in the isolated shack, a silent, unmoving sentinel. She was the dark, petrified heart of the plantation, the nexus of its newfound horror. Her presence ensured that no one could leave, no one could truly escape the fate that had befallen Belle Reve. She was the silent guardian, the absorber of life, a constant draining force that anchored every living soul to the blighted land. Her black, empty eyes, though unseeing, seemed to follow every movement, to draw vitality from every breath. She was the final, inescapable consequence of Blackwood's desperation and Ezekiel's dark arts, a perpetual reminder that the plantation was now irrevocably bound to a fate far beyond human intervention. The shack, once a symbol of Sarah's isolation, was now the epicenter of the plantation's malevolent power. Belle Reve itself transformed into a desolate, silent place, a monument to decay and despair. The once thriving fields, now untended, succumbed to the relentless encroachment of the bayou, the crops rotting in the humid air, reclaiming the land with wild abandon. The main house, once a symbol of grandeur, began its slow, inexorable descent into ruin, its paint peeling, its shutters hanging askew, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the blighted landscape. The remaining slaves, a dwindling and broken cohort, moved like wraiths through this spectral landscape. Their bodies were gaunt, their movements slow and listless, their eyes hollowed out, reflecting a pervasive, soul-crushing fear. They were trapped, slowly losing their life force, their very essence, to Sarah's unnatural existence, a silent, agonizing feed that left them barely clinging to life. The air was thick with a palpable sense of oppression, a heavy shroud of dread that smothered all hope and vitality. Occasionally the outside world, unaware of the horror that had consumed Belle Reve, would intrude upon its desolate silence. A curious traveler, venturing too far off the beaten path, or a distant relative, looking for the now-deceased Blackwood, would venture onto the property. They would approach the main house, perhaps even the slave quarters, looking for signs of life, for answers. But they would find only an unnatural stillness, an eerie quiet broken only by the chirping of unseen insects and the rustling of the wind through the decaying trees. They would see the gaunt, silent figures of the remaining slaves, who would simply stare at them with empty eyes, offering no explanation, no warning. These visitors, lured by an unknown force, would inevitably find themselves drawn towards the isolated shack. Its sickly sweet scent an irresistible, horrifying siren call. They were never seen again. Their bodies would be discovered days, sometimes weeks, later, often near the edges of the property or floating in the murky waters of the bayou. They were drained, utterly lifeless, their skin unnaturally pale, their vitality siphoned away. Yet there were no visible wounds, no signs of struggle, only the profound, inexplicable emptiness of a life consumed. The official reports would speak of drowning or natural causes, but those who found the bodies knew better. The story of Belle Reve, once a whispered rumor, now solidified into a chilling legend that spread like wildfire throughout the bayou. It was a tale told in hushed tones around flickering campfires, a cautionary fable that evoked shivers even on the warmest nights. It spoke of a place where the master's daughter, a burden to her cruel father, had been transformed into a living horror, a grotesque statue that devoured the very essence of life. It spoke of a silent, powerful man, a former slave, who now presided over this plantation of ghosts, his will absolute, his power derived from ancient, forbidden sources. Belle Reve became synonymous with dread, a place to be avoided at all costs, its name a curse whispered by those who knew its terrible secret. The legend grew with each passing year, embellished with new, terrifying details, each one reinforcing the profound, unyielding horror that had taken root deep within the Louisiana swamp. It was a place where the line between life and death, humanity and monstrosity, had blurred into an unspeakable nightmare, a testament to the dark side of human ambition and the terrifying power of the bayou's forgotten magic. Decades passed, blurring into an eternity of decay and silence. Belle Reve, once a vibrant, albeit cruel plantation, had long since succumbed to the relentless embrace of the bayou. The grand main house, a symbol of Blackwood's faded ambition, was now a skeletal ruin, its once proud columns crumbling, its ornate balconies swallowed by thick vines and opportunistic moss. The paint had long flaked away, revealing the rotting wood beneath, and the roof had caved in numerous places, allowing the elements free rein within its hollowed-out chambers. It stood as a decaying shell, a ghostly monument to a forgotten era, its windows like vacant, despairing eyes staring out at the encroaching wilderness. The slave quarters, once filled with the muted sounds of human toil and suffering, had completely collapsed, their timbers scattered and absorbed back into the earth, leaving only faint indentations in the overgrown landscape to mark their former existence. The very land seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, reclaiming what had been forcibly taken from it. But the most potent relic of Belle Reve's dark past, the shack where Sarah had been transformed and imprisoned, persisted. It was a more robust structure, built with a grim purpose, and though it too bore the marks of time and neglect, it remained remarkably intact. It was almost entirely swallowed by the swamp, its foundations sinking deeper into the murky water, its walls draped in curtains of Spanish moss, making it nearly invisible to the casual observer. The air around it was perpetually thick and heavy, laden with the sickly sweet scent of decay, mixed with something indefinably ancient and foul. A smell that had not dissipated with the passage of years, but had intensified, becoming an intrinsic part of the very atmosphere. Even after all this time, the air around Belle Reve retained an oppressive quality, a palpable coldness that defied the humid Louisiana climate. It was a chill that seeped into the bones, a pervasive sense of wrongness that permeated every leaf and every drop of water. The local folk, generations removed from the original horror, still avoided the area with an almost superstitious dread. Their elders, their eyes wide with inherited fear, told cautionary tales of the stone woman who resided within the ruins, a grotesque, petrified figure that drained the life from everything it touched. They spoke of the silent, watchful man, Ezekiel, who had once walked its grounds, a shadowy figure of immense, terrifying power, whose presence still seemed to linger, a phantom sentinel guarding the blighted land. These stories were not mere folklore, they were a living memory, a warning etched into the collective consciousness of the bayou. No one dared to venture near, for fear of falling prey to the lingering malevolence. It was this very legend that, inevitably, drew the curious and the foolish. One scorching afternoon, a young adventurer, a self-proclaimed urban explorer with an insatiable appetite for the macabre and a healthy dose of skepticism, dared to enter the overgrown ruins. He was armed with a camera, a flashlight, and a naive belief that all legends were just stories. Pushing through thickets of thorny vines and navigating treacherous, waterlogged ground, he eventually stumbled upon the nearly submerged shack. The oppressive atmosphere hit him first, a sudden, inexplicable weight on his chest, followed by the pungent, cloying smell that made his stomach churn. He hesitated for a moment, a tremor of unease finally piercing his bravado, but his curiosity proved stronger than his nascent fear. With a deep breath, he pushed open the rotting, swollen door, which groaned in protest, revealing the dim, musty interior. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a scene that instantly froze the blood in his veins. Amidst the decay, the scattered debris and the thick layers of dust, stood what appeared to be a large, grotesque statue. It was Sarah, still alive in her petrified state, a horrifying testament to Ezekiel's dark art. Her body, still massive, was now a hardened, almost crystalline mass, her skin a mottled grey, adorned with strange calcified growths that resembled ancient, twisted bark. Her features were contorted in a silent scream, a perpetual mask of agony and horror, and her eyes, those terrible, empty black orbs, seemed to follow his every movement, devoid of pupils yet radiating an unnerving sentience, a silent predatory awareness that pierced through the centuries. The adventurer felt a sudden, profound exhaustion, an overwhelming weariness that seemed to drain the very marrow from his bones. A chill, unlike any he had ever experienced, pierced him to his core, a coldness that felt less like temperature and more like the absence of life itself. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear alone, but from a terrifying sense of vital energy being siphoned away, a subtle yet undeniable draining. He felt lightheaded, his vision blurring at the edges, and for a terrifying moment he thought he might collapse, becoming another offering to the silent, petrified horror before him. The camera slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering to the damp floor. He fled, stumbling backward out of the shack, scrambling through the thorny undergrowth, driven by a primal, unreasoning terror. He didn't stop running until he burst out of the tree line, gasping for breath, his lungs burning, his body trembling uncontrollably. He had barely made it out alive, forever marked by the encounter, the lingering coldness in his bones a constant reminder of the unspeakable thing he had witnessed. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his soul, that the stories were true. The legends, far from being exaggerated, had barely scratched the surface of the terrifying reality. Belle Reve remained a cursed place, a dark, festering wound upon the Louisiana landscape. It stood as a permanent, horrifying monument to human greed, to the unbridled cruelty of a master, and to the dark, unfathomable power of the bayou's forgotten magic. Sarah's transformed body, a silent, petrified sentinel, continued its eternal vigil within the decaying shack, her black, empty eyes gazing out at an indifferent world. She served as a permanent, horrifying reminder of what happens when humanity is twisted and corrupted beyond recognition, when desperation leads to unspeakable acts, and when ancient, forbidden forces are unleashed. The horror of Blackwood's initial act, his selfish desire to rid himself of his burden, and Ezekiel's chilling, grotesque solution continued to drain life from the land itself, ensuring that Belle Reve, though abandoned, would forever remain a place of unending dread, its dark heart still beating slowly, silently, in the depths of the swamp.